The late afternoon sun cast a golden light over the open fields that separated the old timber farms from the nearby hills, and from a distance, it all looked eternal, unchanged, undisturbed, obedient to the passing of seasons and silence. Along a narrow path carved by repetition more than design, the young woman in plain dress moved like part of the land itself, her steps quiet, her back straight, her hands clutching a worn basket with the care of someone who had known loss too early and too deeply. She was known in the nearby villages only as the quiet girl from the bishop's house, the one who never lingered in markets, who never smiled at outsiders, who never lifted her gaze when a cart passed. But the truth behind her silence was far more intricate than the community would ever guess, and its threads had begun to fray the moment a letter, folded with trembling care, was left at her gate by a man she had never spoken to, yet who somehow saw her more clearly than those who shared her name. He was not Amish, and that alone was enough to set an invisible wall between them. But his upbringing, though different in structure, had been equally rooted in discipline, labor, and the quiet code of men who fix things with their hands when their hearts begin to fail. He had watched her only from a distance for many months, never daring to speak, only observing the rhythm of her presence in the fields and near the well. It wasn't infatuation in the romantic sense. It was something far more painful, a recognition of loneliness in someone who wore it like a second skin, who carried grief without bending, who moved as though the world around her had forgotten how to hold her properly. And so he wrote. The first letter was plain, free from decoration, but soaked in honesty. He described the way the trees curved along the path near her land, the color of the soil after rain, and how some people carry silence not as submission but as survival. He didn't know if she would ever read it. He only knew that if he didn't place it by the gate, the words would begin to rot inside him. But what he didn't know, what he could never have anticipated, was that the bishop, the man who had raised her since childhood, had already decided that such words were poison. With swift precision and a mind trained to guard borders both spiritual and social, the bishop intercepted the note, unfolded it in solitude, and read every line not with curiosity but with calculation. Without burning it, he folded it again, placed it inside a locked drawer with no label, and offered no sign that anything unusual had happened. The girl, unaware of this quiet interception, noticed only a shift in the way the bishop lingered at the front gate the following mornings. She noticed how he began speaking more often about discernment, about voices that mimic goodness but are born from confusion. She didn't understand the timing, nor suspect a reason. Her life had always been structured around submission and stillness. Questions were permitted only when they served understanding, and understanding was defined by the bishop's gaze. Yet even then, something had begun to shift inside her. Not a rebellion, but a dull ache that surfaced when the wind carried the scent of ink and paper instead of wheat and smoke. She found herself pausing longer at the gate, as if the air around it had changed, as if something meant for her had passed through without permission. The young man, unaware of the silent confiscation, mistook the lack of reply as hesitation or modesty. Rather than give up, he wrote again, pouring into the pages his quiet yearning, not for love, but for acknowledgement. In a second letter, he described how silence between people can be more violent than anger, how he had grown tired of talking to those who listened only with their mouths. He wrote about the mornings he spent watching birds land on the same branch outside his window, how they left only when they knew no one was watching. He confessed that he had felt invisible for most of his life until he noticed her, until he realized she was not silent by nature, but silenced by design. Again, he folded the letter with care and left it beneath the slats of the gate, believing in some invisible thread that connected them beyond words. Once again, the bishop acted swiftly, retrieving the letter as if retrieving a trap set by the devil himself. He didn't react with anger. His conviction was colder than that. In his mind, he wasn't hiding affection, he was shielding holiness. He believed that feelings born outside the ordnung were not just forbidden, they were false, sent by confusion, stirred by the enemy. And so he added this second letter to the same drawer, and spoke to the girl that evening about the danger of feelings that arrive uninvited. He spoke about spirits that wear kindness like a costume, and how temptation often sounds like poetry. She listened, as she always did, and said nothing. But that night, her sleep was broken by dreams she couldn't remember, and a sense of something unfinished followed her into morning. The cycle continued. More letters came, each more vulnerable than the last. He began to write not only about what he saw but about what he feared, that she might never see the world beyond the fences built around her, that he might never be allowed to speak his truth aloud. He never begged, never demanded. He only offered fragments of his spirit on paper, hoping they would reach her the way sunlight reaches the forest floor, slowly, softly, without force. And each time, those fragments were caught and hidden, locked away by a man who believed he was saving a soul. By the time winter came, the girl began to feel a sharp ache beneath the quietness of her days. Tasks she had done for years, milking the goats, cleaning the lantern glass, preparing pickled beets, began to feel hollow, like acts performed in someone else's story. She began waking before dawn not to pray, but to stand at the edge of the path near the gate, looking at nothing, hoping for something. She didn't know what. Her chest felt full of unread words, and she didn't understand why. When she tried to pray, her mind wandered not to heaven but to the spaces between footsteps. Something inside her was reaching, but for what, she could not name. The young man began to change as well. The silence wounded him. He no longer hoped for a reply, but he couldn't stop writing. The act had become a kind of mourning. His final letter was written not as a plea, but as a farewell. He wrote that he would no longer trouble her, that he understood silence as an answer, but that a part of him would always carry the image of her walking past the fields without knowing someone had waited for her to turn. He placed it in the hands of a young boy who sometimes delivered eggs to the Amish homes, and he asked him, quietly, urgently, to hand it directly to the girl, to no one else. But fate had no mercy for quiet hopes. The bishop, ever watchful, noticed the exchange and stopped the boy with a question wrapped in kindness. The child, unaware of the consequences, offered up the envelope without hesitation. And so the final letter, like the others, joined the drawer in silence. The bishop prayed over it, convinced he had done what was righteous. He believed he had preserved her future, unaware that what he had truly done was seal her past in a coffin she would never see. And the girl continued to wake with questions she couldn't ask, carrying a sense of being pursued by something invisible. She no longer found peace in the scriptures. She no longer trusted the calmness in the bishop's voice. Something was missing. Something had passed by her gate and never made it through. She didn't know it had a name, a face, or a folded corner worn from trembling hands. All she knew was that she had been on the edge of something unknown, and someone had told her it wasn't from God. The cold settled deep into the soil as the last leaves gave in to gravity and scattered across the wooden porches and frozen paths. Winter came not as a guest, but as a force that reminded everyone of their place, silencing even the birds and carving stillness into the air. Inside the old farmhouse, the girl moved through her days with the mechanical grace of someone who had long ago learned not to disturb the surface of things. Her mornings were quiet, her chores precise, her presence so consistent that it would be easy to believe she had no inner world at all. But beneath the wool layers and the practiced calm, there was a trembling that grew louder with every hour. It had begun subtly, like a breeze shifting direction, but now it was something heavier, something she couldn't name, like the memory of a voice she had never heard. The bishop, ever alert to winds that carried change, noticed the faint disruptions in her rhythm. He noticed that her eyes lingered a moment longer at the window after prayers, that her fingers paused above the final button of her shawl, as if remembering something before pulling it closed. And though she never asked questions, and though her obedience remained intact on the outside, he felt the dissonance building quietly beneath her silence. He responded not with punishment, but with presence. He increased the hours of reading by candlelight, chose passages that spoke of distraction, of foreign influence, of the necessity to sever the soul from emotion. He did not explain, for he believed explanation gave birth to rebellion. Instead, he watched. He guarded. He prayed not for her understanding, but for her submission to return unchallenged. The young man no longer approached the fields. He no longer waited by the distant fence, no longer walked the long path near the chapel on Sundays. Something inside him had hardened, not out of resentment, but out of fatigue. Hope had slowly become humiliation, and every unanswered gesture felt like a conversation he had with no voice on the other side. He worked longer hours, burying himself in labor as if exhaustion could erase the echo of his own vulnerability. The letters had stopped, but the absence of them was not relief. It was a wound that refused to close, like a song that ended mid-note. He wondered if she had read any of them. He imagined she had tossed them, unread, or worse, laughed at their sentimentality. He did not suspect interference. In his mind, silence was her choice, and choice was a truth he could not argue against. The drawer inside the bishop's study had grown heavier with folded papers, each one a confession the girl had never seen, each one a thread that might have pulled her toward a world beyond the one she had been raised to accept. He never burned them. Burning would imply anger, and his actions, in his view, were not born of wrath but of stewardship. He believed that some words, even tender ones, could become weeds if planted in the wrong soil. And so he preserved them not to revisit, but to contain. They sat beneath ledgers and calendars and scripture notes, as still and unread as the girl herself. He told no one. Not the elders. Not the women who helped sew her dresses. Not even the ministers who visited quarterly to check on spiritual health. He carried the knowledge alone. Like a doctor carrying the weight of a diagnosis he refused to share with the patient. The girl, however, had begun to feel something she had no language for. It was not sadness. It was not anger. It was the hollow echo of something lost without knowing what had been offered. She would wake in the early hours with a sense that she had missed something. Not a chore, not a responsibility, but a moment that had passed silently and left no trace. She started walking further from the house in the late afternoons, always under the guise of collecting herbs or feeding the chickens beyond the back fence. But her eyes would scan the distant tree line, searching not for danger, but for a feeling. She didn't know what she expected to find. She only knew that the silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like exile. The bishop noticed the shift. He adjusted his approach. He began speaking more often about God's will in closed doors, about how temptation doesn't always roar but sometimes whispers through opportunity. He spoke of letters in general, how written words could trap a young mind, how clever phrasing could make the soul feel peace where there was only pride. He didn't mention the boy. He didn't need to. He sowed the warnings into her mind like seeds, trusting that fear would water them. And in many ways, it worked. The girl began to doubt her own senses. She began to believe that the ache inside her chest was not longing, but failing. She began to think that questions were not signs of awakening, but signs of weakness. Her silence deepened, but now it was not peaceful. It was haunted. The young man, though absent from the edge of her world, had not forgotten her. He continued to write, not to deliver, but to survive. His journal became a place of refuge, where he wrote letters he never sent, conversations he would never have. He wrote of how it felt to miss someone who had never spoken to you, how strange it was to feel rejected by a stranger who had never promised anything. He carried the guilt of intrusion, but also the stubbornness of someone who had seen something true and refused to pretend it wasn't real. He thought often of that final letter, the one he had begged to be delivered by hand. He never asked the boy what happened. He didn't want confirmation. It was easier to live with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it had reached her and she had chosen not to reply. It hurt less than knowing it had been intercepted. Winter deepened. The snow covered everything with the illusion of purity, hiding the slow decay beneath. Inside the farmhouse, the girl fell into a rhythm that felt more like sleep than life. Days passed with precision. Meals were cooked, prayers were said, but the hours no longer contained meaning. Her hands worked, but her heart wandered. And every so often, in the stillness of a room, she would feel something shift in her chest, as if a memory had tried to return but been denied entry. She would close her eyes and see nothing but the absence of a moment that had never arrived. She had been told that obedience would bring peace, but what she felt now was not peace, it was numbness. The bishop believed he had succeeded. The girl had not asked questions. She had not spoken of strangers or letters or voices from the outside. She had remained under his roof, under his word, under the gaze of a church that required stillness as a form of devotion. But what he failed to see, what he could never measure, was the erosion happening quietly beneath her silence. The soil of her spirit was shifting, slowly but irreversibly, not into rebellion, but into awakening. And while her face remained calm, her hands began to tremble when touching scripture, and her eyes lingered longer at windows, not because she was tempted by the world, but because she had begun to wonder if God had more to say than what the bishop allowed her to hear. Far from her world, the young man continued to live, but not fully. He immersed himself in his work, in family obligations, in the performance of contentment. But late at night, he would return to the same journal, to the same unwritten letters, and he would ask himself how something so pure could feel so wrong. He didn't curse her silence anymore. He had begun to respect it, to understand that some people were trapped in systems too deep to climb out of. He didn't hate the bishop. He didn't even blame him. He just mourned the quiet space where something might have grown, had it not been sealed off before it ever had a chance to bloom. And the girl, still unnamed by the outside world, still invisible to the man who had written her into pages she would never read, continued to rise each morning with a sense that something was waiting just beyond the edge of the field. Something that had once reached for her, softly, and had been pulled back before she could touch it. The thaw came slowly, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to feel warmth. Snow began to withdraw from the edges of barns and fence posts, but the cold lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade. The girl's days remained unchanged on the surface, woven tightly with chores, devotionals, and the quiet submission expected of her. But the frost had begun to crack beneath the layers she wore. Her body moved through the familiar rituals, but her thoughts drifted with increasing weight toward places she could not name, driven by an unease that had no language in the world she knew. The bishop's presence remained constant, a looming force that shaped the limits of her questions and carved obedience into every corner of her life. Yet something in her had shifted, a slow burning beneath the surface that no longer accepted silence as clarity. She did not understand the cause, only that the peace she had once equated with righteousness now felt more like a mask stretched tightly across something far more human. Inside the farmhouse, the walls carried the warmth of routine but none of the comfort. Each room seemed to echo more loudly with absence, and even the sound of the fire crackling at dawn began to feel performative, as if the house itself were pretending everything was as it had always been. The girl had started to retreat deeper into herself, not out of rebellion, but because there was nowhere else for her longing to go. She still rose early and moved through her work with the same methodical grace, but something in her hands had changed. They were slower, more hesitant, as though she feared that whatever she touched might crumble under the weight of her wondering. The bishop noticed these subtleties but responded only by tightening the structure around her. He shortened the time she spent in the fields alone, added new readings to the evenings, and made sure the sermons focused more heavily on temptation masked as sincerity. He believed himself a shepherd protecting his flock, unaware that the sheep in his care had already begun to wake to the idea that the gate might open both ways. Far from the fences and watchful eyes, the young man no longer measured his days by labor alone. Though he worked more than ever, rising before the sun and resting long after the moon had taken its place, he carried an emptiness that no task could fill. The letters had stopped long ago, but the act of writing had left behind a residue, an imprint on his soul that would not be erased by time or silence. He still thought of her, not with bitterness, but with a quiet ache that surfaced most often in the stillness of the early morning. He wondered whether she had ever known he had written. He wondered whether she had chosen silence or if silence had been chosen for her. These thoughts came not as accusations, but as shadows that walked beside him, especially when the world around him quieted enough for memory to resurface. In those moments, he would sometimes take out the journal where the unsent letters now lived and read through them not to remember her, but to remember the part of himself that had once believed his words could matter. The bishop continued his quiet campaign of containment. He believed he had succeeded in protecting the girl from spiritual corrosion, never realizing that the damage had already been done, not by the letters, but by their absence. The girl had begun to see the boundaries not as safety, but as walls. She had no proof, no knowledge of the letters themselves, only the growing sense that something had been hidden from her, something that had come close and been taken away before it could be understood. She often found herself pausing at the gate where the breeze changed, where the slats had once held a presence she could not recall. The space felt different there, as if it remembered something she did not. Though she said nothing of these feelings, they began to shape her internal world, building a landscape of doubt where before there had been only devotion. She began to wonder if God truly lived only within the words she had been taught to recite, or if he might be whispering from beyond the edges of her assigned path. Her tasks began to feel heavier, not physically, but spiritually. Each step in the routine demanded a kind of blindness she no longer wished to maintain. She still complied, but no longer believed that submission equaled virtue. Instead, she performed her duties with a quiet observation, taking note of how much had been constructed around her to ensure that no room for deviation remained. She noticed how questions were treated as illness, how silence was rewarded, and how fear wore the mask of wisdom. These realizations did not come in a rush, but slowly, like the dripping of ice from a rooftop, accumulating into something that could not be ignored. She began to carry the weight of knowledge she did not yet have, but which had already begun to reshape the contours of her faith. The young man, unaware of the quiet awakening occurring miles away, had started to let go, not of the memory of her, but of the need for resolution. He no longer sought meaning in her silence, choosing instead to build a life around the absence. Yet in doing so, he had unknowingly carved out a place inside himself where the longing could continue to live without consuming him. He returned more often to his journal, this time not to write letters, but to reflect on the man he had become in the process of writing them. He realized he had learned to speak from the center of his heart without expecting applause or reply, and in that, he had found a kind of liberation. The sorrow remained, but it no longer defined him. It had simply become part of the architecture of who he was. Spring began to press gently against the edges of the cold, and with it came a soft uncoiling of breath in the land and in the girl. Something in her had begun to shift in rhythm with the soil. She felt it most in the mornings, when the sky was still pale and the birds began to test their voices again. It was in these quiet awakenings that she felt closest to the truth she could not name. The gate continued to call to her, not with urgency, but with memory. And though she had never been told what had once passed through it, her body seemed to remember. Her hands would hover near the wood as if expecting something to be there, something that had once been meant for her. And in those moments, the silence felt different, not protective, but punitive, not chosen, but enforced. The bishop's control remained intact, but even he began to sense that the foundation had weakened. The girl's eyes no longer reflected unquestioning obedience. There was depth now, a shadow of thought, a delay before she responded. She had not disobeyed, but her spirit had begun to move at a pace he could no longer predict. He responded by increasing the sermons, by drawing her further into the rituals, by surrounding her with constant reminders of the community's expectations. But it was too late. The cracks had formed. She had begun to question not just his voice, but the silence that had been placed in her mouth for so long. As the ground softened and the first signs of new life pushed through the earth, the girl stood once again at the edge of the field, her eyes scanning the place where the horizon met possibility. She did not know what she was waiting for, only that something had once reached for her, and though it had been taken away, its echo remained in her bones. She no longer believed that silence was always holy, nor that obedience was always truth. She understood now that there were forces greater than fear, and that sometimes, the voice of God sounded more like longing than law. And so she continued to move through the days, unchanged in action but transformed in awareness. The bishop watched her closely, still convinced he could restore the quiet he had curated. But what he failed to grasp was that the girl was no longer afraid of her questions. She had begun to feel them not as threats, but as invitations. And though she did not yet know where they would lead, she had already decided that when the moment came, when the next letter reached her, in whatever form it might take, she would be ready not to fear it, but to listen. The rain came first, soft and uncertain, washing away the final traces of snow that had clung to the corners of the land like old grief. It soaked into the earth without warning, loosening the ground and releasing the scent of forgotten growth beneath layers of hardened silence. In the quiet farmhouse tucked beyond the trees, the girl moved through the dim light of early morning with a weight in her chest that no longer felt abstract. It had taken shape in her bones, pressing against the rhythm of her breath and anchoring itself beneath her ribs. Her chores had not changed, and neither had the expressions on the faces around her, but something in the air had shifted in a way that could not be named aloud. There was no language for how the mind expands when it begins to see what it was taught not to question. There was no scripture for how the body remembers things it was never told. Yet she felt it with increasing clarity, this pull toward something invisible, like a name she was not allowed to say but which echoed each time her fingers brushed the gate where nothing was supposed to exist. She had not dared to speak of her unrest. The community structure did not allow for interiority to be explored unless it came clothed in confessions the elders already approved. But confession required knowing what one was guilty of, and she still had no name for her discomfort. She continued to rise before the sun, to pluck vegetables from the garden, to weave baskets and mend torn aprons. Her hands remained steady, but her spirit now wavered in places where it had once been rigid. She felt it most in moments of stillness, while boiling water for laundry, or folding sheets in the room that still carried her parents' scent from years ago. She would pause mid-motion, her body frozen in space, as if time had parted just wide enough to remind her that something had been kept from her. These moments were brief, easily masked by resumed activity, but they formed a pattern known only to her, like stones lining a hidden path she had begun to follow without realizing. The bishop, consumed with maintaining appearances and spiritual boundaries, continued his regimen with greater intensity. He tightened the fabric of her daily schedule until each hour was accounted for. He introduced longer readings after supper and added more voices to the teachings, visiting elders, stricter examples, sharper warnings. He wove parables into every sentence, planting lessons that dressed themselves as protection but grew from fear. He believed that her recent quiet was a sign of recommitment, a retreat into the safety of discipline. He did not see that her silence was no longer shaped by obedience, but by study. She had begun to observe him the way she once observed birds outside the window, measuring his movements, the cadence of his sermons, the way his voice shifted when he described the outside world. She noticed that his eyes never met hers directly when he spoke of letters, that his shoulders carried an extra stillness whenever the word temptation passed through his mouth. These details did not form accusations, only questions, and those questions now accompanied her like shadows in daylight. Elsewhere, the young man's days had become more mechanical. He rose, worked, ate, and slept. He no longer hoped for response, nor dreamed of redemption. The ache had dulled into routine, and he had convinced himself that the episode had passed, that the memory of the girl, the letters, the silence, had faded like a season that comes and goes without leaving any lasting damage. But even in that assumed closure, he found himself walking routes he had once walked when she filled his thoughts. He passed the same tree lines, the same market stalls, the same edges of distant fields where the land blurred into her world. He did not admit it to himself, but a part of him was still listening, for a sound, a signal, a sign that something had changed. And though he had stopped writing, the words still composed themselves in his mind, shaping sentences he never intended to send. They came to him in the quietest moments, not as pain, but as possibility. A possibility he had locked away, but which refused to die. The girl's awakening took root not as a moment of defiance, but as a long unraveling of all the truths she had accepted without question. She began to recognize that certain forms of control wore the appearance of care, that protection could be used as a tool of isolation. She began to read the pauses in conversation, the choices of scripture, the absence of certain topics as deeply as she once read the verses themselves. Her faith had not disappeared, but it had shifted. She still believed in God, but now she wondered whose voice she had actually been listening to all these years. The bishop's presence no longer felt like a bridge to the divine, but a barrier erected to filter the light before it could reach her. She still knelt when expected, still bowed her head when required, but her heart had begun to beat to a different rhythm, one that whispered of windows opening, not walls being built. She found herself watching the gate more frequently, standing near it with no justification, her hands grazing the wood where something unseen had once rested. She did not know why it mattered, only that it did. Her fingertips would pause on the grain, as if the wood carried a message that had been erased. The ground there seemed to remember more than she did. Though she had no knowledge of the letters, her body reacted as though it had been robbed. She did not cry, nor did she protest. Her rebellion, if it could be called that, remained internal. But it grew stronger each day, nourished by every small contradiction she noticed, every line of scripture that no longer felt alive, every moment of silence that now felt strategic rather than sacred. The bishop continued to fortify his role as guardian of her purity. He sensed that her inner world had begun to shift, but he attributed it to spiritual confusion, a passing trial to be managed with stronger discipline. He called for more visits from elder women, assigned her to more collective tasks, inserted himself into her routines with increased frequency. He feared losing control, though he would never admit that such a fear lived in him. He wrapped it in holy language, convinced himself that he was acting as a servant of God rather than a warden of his own authority. He did not believe she would leave. He did not believe she had the capacity for such divergence. What he failed to see was that the foundation of control does not crack with explosions, but with erosion, slow, patient, and irreversible once begun. The young man continued to live quietly, unaware that the silence he had once cursed had never been hers to break. He had buried the hope, buried it so deeply that even its memory had begun to dissolve. Yet something in the atmosphere began to hum differently, and though he did not understand it, he began to feel restless again. He found himself returning to places he had avoided, touching the edges of the field where he had once watched her walk, feeling the air with a kind of reverence he could not explain. He did not plan to reach out again. He did not believe there was anything left to say. But the ground felt thinner now, like the distance between them had changed, not in space, but in weight. And the girl, now standing fully within her own awareness, began to sense that the life she had lived was not the only one available to her. She did not know what else existed, nor what path might lead her there, but she no longer feared the question. She began to pray differently, less in recitation, more in contemplation. She no longer asked what she should do, but what she had missed. And though no voice answered, the silence that followed no longer felt empty. It felt full of something waiting to be revealed. She still obeyed the structures around her, but with each passing day, her soul pressed more firmly against the walls, and the walls, for the first time in her life, began to tremble. The days had grown longer, and with each additional minute of sunlight, the stillness that had once protected the girl began to feel less like shelter and more like confinement. Spring no longer whispered, it demanded. Buds pushed through the once frozen earth with a certainty that made the stillness inside her feel unbearable. Her body moved as it always had, performing duties that had defined her life for as long as memory served. Yet now, every gesture seemed to echo with a deeper question. The silence surrounding her no longer felt holy. It pulsed with absences, things unsaid, things withheld, and things taken from her before she had even known they were hers. The weight of it pressed more firmly each day, and though she never let it show in the softness of her expression or the smoothness of her posture, her interior world had begun to expand beyond the limits of obedience. The gate she once passed without thought now held gravity. The path beyond it tugged at her senses like a memory from a life never lived. She could no longer look at it without feeling as if something had once arrived there and been swept away before it could speak her name. Inside the bishop's home, the rhythms continued as if nothing had changed, but something had. The air had thickened with unspoken tension, and the girl's silences, once signs of piety, had become unreadable. She no longer deferred in the same instinctual way. Her hands still served, her eyes still lowered, but beneath it all lived a quiet alertness, a presence that was not waiting for permission but watching, absorbing, decoding. The bishop had noticed the shift. He had not spoken of it, but he had redoubled his efforts to surround her with structure. His prayers had grown longer, his warnings more frequent, his need to be near her more persistent. He spoke often of storms, those that came from within and those that tested the faithful. He described temptation in broader strokes now, crafting images meant to instill fear, to make the outside world seem wild, dangerous, filled with voices that seduced the weak into abandoning their place in God's order. But where once these teachings had been absorbed without question, now they were received with a stillness that could no longer be mistaken for agreement. The girl listened, but not to his words. She listened to what he did not say, to the patterns of avoidance that circled certain topics. She noticed how often he brought up deception when her eyes wandered to the gate. She noticed how his voice caught when he mentioned loyalty. She noticed that every new reading was about danger, not grace. About discipline, not love. It was as though he feared something slipping through the cracks, something that had already arrived and been lost. She began to wonder if the unease she carried had a source beyond her own thoughts. She began to wonder what had passed by her life without her knowing, what messages had been intercepted, what truths had been dressed as sins. The rain returned in waves that softened the ground and made the roads too thick to walk for long. She spent more time indoors, helping with mending, preparing meals, organizing linens, performing the same tasks with the same efficiency. But now, her thoughts did not follow the rhythm of her hands. They wandered. She imagined what a letter might have looked like. What it would feel like to see her name written by someone who had seen her from a distance and felt compelled to speak. She imagined what those words might have said. She did not know of the letters hidden in the bishop's drawer, but she could feel the shape of them in her longing. It was as if something had spoken to her in dreams and been erased before waking. And though she had no evidence, no proof, she could no longer escape the feeling that something had been taken from her, not out of malice, but out of fear. The bishop maintained his composure, though inside he had grown uneasy. Control was something he had always possessed without effort. It had been the natural result of his place in the community, his voice wrapped in the language of spiritual guidance, his rules accepted as divine instruction. But now, in this house where one girl's silence no longer felt submissive, he had begun to sense that authority could rot from the inside without anyone noticing. He watched her more closely, responded with immediate redirection whenever her gaze lingered too long at the window. He planned lessons with care, adjusted his voice to sound less forceful, more loving, as though affection might succeed where fear had begun to fail. But she had already seen the gap between his words and their purpose. She had already begun to trust what she felt more than what she was told. And no amount of new scripture could replace the absence of what she now sensed had been hidden. Elsewhere, the young man moved through his life with the steadiness of someone who had trained himself to survive disappointment. He worked, he ate, he rested. But there was a hollowness in everything now. The letters he had written lived in a drawer of his own, not hidden but untouched. He had not read them since the day he stopped writing. They remained folded, stacked, aged by time and air. He sometimes sat beside them, unsure why he hadn't thrown them away. They no longer felt like offerings. They felt like remnants of a language no one spoke. Still, he could not bring himself to burn them. There was something sacred about those pages, not because of what they contained, but because of what they represented. A moment when his words had reached out in honesty, even if they had never been received. He did not know if she had read any of them. He had long stopped hoping for an answer. But he also could not stop wondering if silence had truly been her choice. The fields began to bloom again, and with the bloom came noise. Bees, birds, new footsteps on old paths. The girl began to leave the house more often, under the pretense of gathering herbs or checking the soil. But she no longer walked with detachment. Her steps carried intent now. She stopped near the gate more openly, no longer pretending she had dropped something or needed to adjust her bonnet. She simply stood there, breathing in the space. She still did not know why, but the pull was no longer something she resisted. There were no answers waiting for her. No signs, no confessions, no pieces of paper tucked into the wood. And yet the silence around that gate felt different than the silence inside the house. It felt honest. Not empty, but paused. And she began to understand that not all stillness was equal. Some was designed to protect. Some was used to erase. She began rising earlier, finishing her work with greater speed so that she could reach the outer fields before the bishop noticed. She walked slowly, observing everything, the way the wind bent the grass, the way insects moved in patterns that seemed deliberate. She was searching, though she didn't know for what. A clue. A memory. A confirmation that her sense of something lost was not insanity, but instinct. Each time she returned without discovery, she told herself it was foolishness. But the next day, she returned anyway. Her persistence was not born of defiance, but of hunger. A hunger to reclaim something she had never possessed but now knew was hers by right. Inside, the bishop began to suspect that the shift had passed the point of reversal. He prayed more often, but the prayers no longer brought him peace. They became negotiations, pleas for stability, for silence, for order to return. He watched her with increased vigilance, but she had learned how to move without alerting him. She had learned how to listen without reacting, how to observe without offering cues. He felt the distance growing, but he did not understand how it had started. He believed that his interception of those early letters had ended the threat. He did not realize that in hiding them, he had planted the very seed he had feared, a seed that had grown silently, invisibly, until it could no longer be contained. And so, with each passing day, the girl stood more fully in the space between who she had been and who she was becoming. She had not spoken. She had not rebelled. But her silence was now her own. And it was no longer the kind the bishop could claim as obedience. It was the silence of listening, to the world, to her body, to the questions that refused to die. And though she still did not know the full truth of what had been taken from her, she no longer doubted that something had been, something written, something meant, something hidden in the name of protection. She did not yet know how to name her grief, but she had begun to prepare space for its arrival. The warmth of summer arrived not in bursts of joy but in the slow, oppressive weight of still air and long days, stretching across the land like a hush that refused to break. The garden flourished, the animals found their shade, and the sun rose earlier and lingered longer, casting its light over every corner of the farm until even the smallest shadow had nowhere to hide. Within this unbearable clarity, the girl moved like a presence tethered to routine by threads that grew thinner with each step. Her body followed the rhythm expected of her, canning fruit, sweeping porches, patching fabric, but her spirit now lived elsewhere, hovering just beyond the frame of her tasks. Something had begun to gather inside her, not sudden or sharp, but thick and constant like humidity in the lungs. It was not rebellion and not sorrow, but something deeper, something that made her feel both full and hollow at once. The weight of unspoken things had become physical, and every room she entered seemed to tighten around her, as though the walls themselves sensed that she no longer belonged entirely within them. Her awareness had sharpened to such a degree that the smallest details now struck her like revelations. The way the bishop paused at the drawer near his study and adjusted its lock with care he never used elsewhere. The way he glanced out the window when she walked near the gate, not with curiosity but with suspicion. The way he added new passages to their nightly readings, always framed in caution, always warning against deception, always portraying inquiry as the enemy of faith. These signs no longer slipped past her as they once had. She collected them quietly, stacking them in the corners of her mind like bricks, building a structure she had not yet named. She did not confront them. She had not yet found the place within herself from which confrontation could rise, but she no longer dismissed them. They settled into her thoughts like seeds pressed into fertile soil, and under the light of her awakening, they began to root. The bishop, feeling the change in atmosphere but unable to pinpoint its source, grew restless beneath his carefully composed exterior. He redoubled his efforts to control the narrative of her life without appearing forceful. He increased her responsibilities, redirected her tasks away from the outer fields and toward the center of the community, where more eyes could be upon her. He spoke more frequently about temptation from the outside, about the dangers of straying not just in action but in thought. But the girl no longer received his teachings as sacred truths. She heard them now as strategies, words used not to guide, but to hold in place. And the more he tried to cover the past with doctrine, the more she felt its absence press against her skin. She did not know the full shape of what had been withheld, but she had learned to trust the silence between the lines. She knew something had once reached for her and been stopped. And that knowledge, vague though it was, had become irreversible. Meanwhile, the young man had fallen into a rhythm of acceptance that resembled peace but held within it the quiet ache of unresolved longing. He worked, he helped his neighbors, he attended local gatherings, always with the ease of someone who had learned to hide his bruises beneath competence. The letters remained untouched in his drawer, but their presence never left him. He no longer dreamed of the girl, but she appeared in his thoughts without invitation, not as a figure of fantasy but as a question that had never been answered. He had told himself that closure did not require contact, that some things ended without conclusion. And yet, there were mornings when he woke with a sense that something unfinished still lingered in the air, that words spoken in truth had not vanished but had simply taken a longer path to reach the one for whom they were meant. The girl began to move differently through the world. Her steps remained measured, her voice soft, her presence quiet, but there was a new clarity behind her eyes that unsettled those who had always taken comfort in her silence. The other women noticed first, though none spoke of it directly. They saw how she no longer bent as quickly to correction, how her hands paused in thought before returning to work, how her gaze remained steady when met. The men noticed too, but responded with awkward distance, unsure of how to address a change they could not define. The bishop, however, felt it like a chill in the center of his chest. He began to sense that whatever had once made her moldable had been replaced by something firm, something that listened without yielding, that considered without immediately obeying. He could not see the origin of this shift, and that made it dangerous. He returned again and again to the drawer, rereading the letters he had hidden so long ago, as if searching for a sentence that might justify his decision, a phrase he could point to and say, "This is why I took them." But none of the words felt poisonous now. They felt human. And it was that humanity that unsettled him most. One afternoon, while reorganizing the house for the summer season, the girl was asked to clean the bishop's study. It was not an unusual task, she had done so many times before, but this time, as she entered the room and took in the scent of parchment and old wood, something inside her shifted. She worked methodically, dusting shelves, wiping surfaces, straightening the books along the wall. But her movements were slower than usual, and her eyes lingered longer on the drawer at the far end of the desk. She did not approach it at first. She swept around it, cleaned beneath it, moved past it. But its presence grew larger with each minute, as if the very air in the room were drawn toward it. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with anticipation, as though they remembered what her mind did not. She touched the edge of the drawer lightly, as if testing the temperature of truth. It was locked, of course. That much had never changed. But the simple act of reaching toward it, of acknowledging its weight, changed something in her. She did not need to open it to know it contained something meant for her. She felt its gravity. And when she left the room, she was no longer uncertain. That evening, as the sky turned to a soft haze and the cicadas began their hum, the girl sat alone outside the barn, watching the horizon dissolve into dusk. She did not cry. She did not speak. But her heart beat with a new rhythm, slow, sure, relentless. She did not yet know what she would do. But she understood now, with a clarity that required no confirmation, that her life had been shaped by a decision she had never been allowed to make. That someone had spoken on her behalf, not with her voice but in place of it. And that the silence she had worn for so long was not a reflection of her soul, but a result of its interruption. She did not rage. She did not plan revenge. Her resolve was quieter than that. It lived in her breath, in the set of her jaw, in the stillness of her spine. The bishop felt the change as absence before he recognized it as presence. She did not speak differently, but the air around her no longer responded to his authority in the same way. His words no longer settled into her as easily. His instructions no longer echoed without resistance. He searched for explanations in scripture, in prayer, in memory. But he did not find relief. He only found the letters, now just paper, but heavier than stone. He had believed he was protecting her. He had convinced himself that silence was salvation. But what he had truly done was interrupt the natural current of her becoming. And now that current had returned, stronger, colder, and beyond his reach. As night fell, the girl remained outside, staring into the distance where the path disappeared into the trees. Somewhere out there, the echo of the words meant for her still lingered, and though they had been kept from her, she could feel their shape in the wind. She knew that nothing written with truth ever truly vanished. It simply waited, quietly, patiently, for the right moment to be heard. And though she had no plan, no map, and no permission, she had already begun to listen. The weeks that followed blurred into a sequence of days heavy with heat and filled with the scent of overripe fruit, damp wood, and the thick breath of a land that had not seen rain. The girl moved through these days with the same mechanical precision, but something within her had fully crossed the threshold. She no longer lived inside the rhythm assigned to her, she moved through it with the awareness of someone watching from the outside. She had learned how to carry her transformation like a hidden ember, shielded from wind, invisible to those who did not look closely, yet hot enough to burn through anything that tried to press it down. The silence around her had become denser, not because she had withdrawn, but because every surface around her now recoiled from the new shape of her spirit. Her gaze no longer lowered by instinct. Her posture no longer bent from within. Her hands still completed the tasks, but they did so with the stillness of a person who had made a decision too large to be spoken aloud. She had begun to wake earlier than usual, not out of obligation but necessity. The moments before sunrise were now the only ones that felt truly hers, untouched by the bishop's eyes or the weight of doctrine. In those hours, she walked with intention to the furthest reaches of the property, where the outer fence met the bend of the road that once led toward the distant hills. There, she stood not as a servant to routine, but as a question the land itself could not answer. The morning light painted everything in soft contradiction, casting long shadows over the fence posts while setting the grass alight in gold. And in that hour between darkness and day, she felt herself most clearly, no longer a girl awaiting instruction, but a woman carrying the silence of her own withheld history. She did not cry. She did not tremble. But the breath that left her body as she stood at that border was heavy with everything she had never been allowed to name. The bishop, sensing her withdrawal but unable to isolate its origin, fell into a pattern of subtle escalation. He did not raise his voice, but his expectations became sharper, his questions more invasive, his presence more constant. He hovered near doorways, reappeared in places he did not belong, adjusted the structure of their days to keep her in sight as often as possible. Yet the more he closed the circle around her, the more her presence seemed to slip beyond its edges. He could feel the difference in her silence. It no longer bent. It no longer waited for his interpretation. It stood on its own, steady, unresponsive, sovereign. He had once believed that obedience was the highest virtue, that spiritual clarity could only be achieved through surrender. But now, facing the quiet authority that had emerged in her, he began to suspect that perhaps what he had called rebellion was something else entirely. Something older, stronger, and far less manageable. Within the small drawer in his study, the letters remained untouched, but their existence had begun to haunt him. He no longer opened them. He no longer read their lines. Yet the knowledge of them, the awareness of what they contained and what he had kept from her, moved through the house like a hidden draft. It tugged at his prayers, interrupted his sermons, unsettled his breath during moments of stillness. He had believed he was acting in righteousness. He had framed his decisions as protection, as moral stewardship. But now, as the girl's spirit began to uncoil beyond his reach, the clarity of that justification began to blur. He did not regret his choices, but neither could he rest within them. He felt pursued, not by her, not by the boy who had once left the letters, but by the very silence he had worked so hard to maintain. It was no longer still. It whispered now, and it was not whispering in his favor. The girl continued to stand at the edge of the fields each morning, her eyes tracing the same distant point on the road where the horizon dipped into the unknown. She had not yet decided what she would do. She did not know what paths were available to her, nor what consequences waited beyond the borders of the life she had been assigned. But she no longer questioned whether the silence had been imposed. She knew it now. She could feel it in the way her body responded to the gate, to the drawer in the study, to the way the bishop avoided certain phrases when her presence grew too still. Something had been taken from her, softly, strategically, without confrontation. She had been edited, and the realization of that theft did not make her angry. It made her precise. She moved with the deliberation of someone rebuilding a map from ashes, piecing together the shape of what had once been offered and then erased. The young man, unaware of the shifts taking place, continued to live in the shadow of what he had once tried to give. He had stopped waiting. He had stopped imagining. But the weight of the unanswered remained like sediment in the corners of his life, settling in places he did not often look but could not fully clean. The drawer that held his letters remained shut, but each time he passed it, he felt the slow ache of time press into him. He told himself that some things never arrive, that sometimes truth is not enough to breach distance. He had learned to survive that truth, to wear it without complaint. But deep within him, there remained a small chamber of wonder, a place not yet sealed, where the question still pulsed. What would have happened if she had known? The answer to that question was beginning to form, not in words, but in the shifting of her choices. The girl had begun to revisit every detail of her life with new eyes. She watched the others now, not with deference, but with inquiry. She studied how decisions were made, how voices were given weight, how certain perspectives were praised while others were erased. She began to see the structure for what it was, not a path to holiness, but a system of control shaped to resemble devotion. Her faith had not died, but it had changed. It no longer depended on approval. It no longer required permission. She still prayed, but her prayers were no longer recitations. They were conversations, honest, uneasy, unfinished. One evening, as dusk fell heavy over the land and the air thickened with the scent of dust and distance, she returned to the gate and stood with both hands resting on the top rail. The wood was warm beneath her palms, as if it held the memory of everything it had once touched. She did not expect to find anything there. She no longer looked for evidence. But she felt the weight of that place with a clarity that tightened her chest. This was the point of interception. This was where something had once reached for her and been removed before it could be received. She did not need to know the words to understand their absence. She only needed to feel what remained behind. And what remained was presence, thick, steady, undeniable. Something had been said. Something had been silenced. And she had begun, finally, to hear it. The bishop, watching from the house, knew he had lost something. Not control. Not authority. But access. He could no longer enter her spirit. His words no longer shaped her understanding. His presence no longer redirected her path. She had become her own compass. And though she had not spoken against him, had not defied a single instruction, he felt the distance between them now as clearly as if she had walked away. He did not know what would come next. But for the first time, he understood that he would not be the one to decide. The girl turned from the gate and walked back toward the house, not hurriedly, not hesitantly, but with the calm of someone who had begun to carry her own name again. She did not yet know what she would do, but the silence had broken, not through noise, but through truth. And the sound it left behind was louder than anything she had ever been taught to fear. The morning she rose before anyone else, the sky had not yet shifted from deep blue to gray. The air was thick with the promise of heat, but the earth remained cool beneath her bare feet as she stepped out past the porch, through the dew-soaked grass, and onto the dirt path that had once meant nothing and now meant everything. Her body moved with purpose, but her breath was steady, quiet. There was no trembling in her hands, no haste in her stride. She was not running. She was arriving. Every step toward the outer fields brought her closer not to escape, but to understanding, a reckoning not with the world, but with the version of herself that had been carefully arranged and obediently maintained for as long as she could remember. And yet, even in this quiet determination, there was no violence. She wasn't rejecting her life. She was reclaiming what had been kept from her within it. The road ahead was not paved with rebellion but with clarity, and she walked it not as a girl with doubts, but as a woman with a right to question the silence she had been taught to keep. She reached the gate just as the light began to rise, gold peeling over the horizon and filtering through the trees with the softness of breath. The wood felt familiar under her hands, and for the first time, she leaned into it not as someone hoping to remember, but as someone who had already remembered. She had come to know the truth not by confession or revelation, but by the slow, aching accumulation of absence. The stillness had spoken. The gaps had widened. And between them, she had heard what had once been hidden. No letters had ever reached her hands. No pages had ever carried her name across that threshold. But she had heard them nonetheless. She had heard them in the pauses, in the shifting tone of a voice meant to distract her, in the carefully constructed routines designed to keep her still. And now, she no longer needed to see the ink. She no longer needed to hold the paper. The message had survived, because the soul it was meant for had remained open. Back in the house, the bishop rose to the sound of floorboards stretching beneath the weight of day. He moved through the kitchen with mechanical familiarity, setting the kettle, drawing water, scanning the yard through the narrow window above the sink. But this time, when he looked out, he did not see movement near the barn or clothesline. He saw the gate, and he saw her standing there. Not like before, not in fleeting moments of hesitation, but fully, solidly, with a stillness so absolute that it disrupted the frame of everything he had tried to maintain. In that moment, he understood something not through fear, but through finality. Whatever he had believed he was shaping, whatever obedience he thought he had secured, had already gone. She had crossed into herself. She had reached the place he had tried to protect her from, and found it not dangerous, but necessary. And though she had not moved beyond the fence, the distance between them had become permanent. She no longer looked to him for permission. She no longer needed the safety of his boundaries. Her silence had become her own. The young man, unaware of the transformation unfolding beyond the tree line, woke as he always did, with the sound of morning birds and the weight of another ordinary day. But something in him stirred, as if the atmosphere had shifted, as if the air held a different kind of stillness. He stepped outside, unaware of the time or the reason, and stood barefoot in the dirt, watching the edge of the forest that separated him from the road that led nowhere and everywhere. He did not know she stood at the same moment on the other side. He did not know that she had felt what he had once tried to give. But the memory of her returned, not as longing, but as peace. He no longer needed to wonder. Somewhere deep within him, without logic or proof, he felt a door had opened. Not between them, perhaps, but within her. And that was enough. The girl turned from the gate not to retreat, but to carry the truth with her. She no longer sought freedom as escape. She had found it in the quiet certainty that she could now move through her life without the weight of someone else's decisions closing every window before it was opened. She returned to the house, not with urgency, but with sovereignty. The path had not changed. The walls were still the same. The bishop remained at the head of the table. But the power no longer belonged to him. The silence no longer obeyed him. She had listened. She had heard. She had remembered. And though she had not spoken a single word, her presence now carried the weight of 1,000 withheld truths. That evening, as she prepared the meal with the same careful hands, the same quiet rhythm, the world around her continued its performance of order. But inside her, the shape of her life had changed. She was no longer waiting for something to arrive. She was no longer reaching for something lost. She had received it. It had come to her not through touch or sight, but through the cracks in the silence, through the space between what was said and what was meant. And now, every step she took from this day forward would be hers. Not dictated, not redirected, not explained away. Hers. To those watching, she might still appear the same girl in the same clothes, moving through the same routines. But she was no longer carrying only tasks. She was carrying knowledge. The kind no one can take once it has been felt. The kind that lives in the breath, in the stillness, in the gaze of someone who now knows their voice was never meant to stay hidden. And though she had never answered the letters, though she had never read their lines, the truth within them had found its way to her. Not because of what was written, but because of what had been denied. And in that denial, she had discovered everything. If you felt the weight of this story, if you recognized the pain of silence, the power of discovery, and the beauty of hearing what was silenced, subscribe to the channel. Here, each story holds a truth that deserves to be heard.